Hello, and welcome to Buck's ASMR. I'm Buck, and today is story time, brought to you by r/TrueCrime. Today's story is from Wonderful Variation and is about Chelsea Bruck, so sit back, relax, and let's go on an adventure. Chelsea Bruck, 22 years old. Michigan woman dressed as Batman villain goes missing after Halloween party, triggering a statewide search and media frenzy. Police chase multiple false leads before arriving at a dead end. She is eventually found buried on a farmer's property. Chelsea Bruck, a 22-year-old woman, was reported missing on October 28, 2014. At the time, she was living in Monroe County, Michigan. Chelsea was last seen on October 26th at a Halloween party. She'd gone dressed as the Batman character Poison Ivy. She'd put a lot of work into her costume. The party was held in a cornfield near Big Mike's farmhouse. The party was hosted in Frenchtown Township, and it was organized by a man known as Big Mike. The Halloween party was an annual event, but this year would be bigger and better than ever. 8 heavy metal bands were scheduled to play, including Big Mike's own band, Pickaxe Preacher. It was expected that around 350 people would show up, but well over double that number ended up attending that year. The party was known as Big Mike's Halloween Bash. Chelsea had spent a lot of time building her Poison Ivy costume, which she'd made herself. The costume consisted of a green suit and black leggings, covered with plastic leaves, which Brooke had sewn onto the fabric. She'd started making this costume during the summer. Now, it was finally time for her to wear it. She hoped to win a prize for best costume at the party. Chelsea did not have her own car, and in fact, she could not drive at all. She did not even have a driver's license. She was driven to the party by a friend, Becky. She left her cell phone and purse in Becky's car because her costume did not have any pockets. However, this meant that when Becky left the party, Chelsea was left without her cell phone. Chelsea had a great time at the party until she injured her head. She was intoxicated and she ran into a post, smashing her nose. After that, she then told her friends that she wanted to leave. She felt confused and disoriented from the head injury, and her nose was bleeding profusely. But her friends weren't ready to leave yet. They wanted to keep partying. Chelsea would have to wait for her friends to be done at the party before she could get a ride home. However, Chelsea became separated from her friends, and they ended up leaving without her around 1 a.m. She was seen in the parking lot around 3 a.m. crying. She said that she'd been abandoned and she needed a ride home. Bruck's friends have both said that leaving Chelsea at that party is, and always will be, the greatest regret of their lives. Both of the friends were very active in the search for Chelsea. They cared a lot about Chelsea, and they understood that they'd made a huge mistake. When Big Mike awoke the day after the party, he found that he'd already received dozens of text messages asking if he knew what happened to Chelsea. He didn't know who Chelsea was, but he agreed to look around the farm field to see if maybe she'd passed out or something. But while he was searching through the cornfield with his dog, the dog got stuck in a trap and was injured. Bruck was reported missing by her family on October 28th after she failed to return home. That same day, Chelsea's mother, Leanda, personally drove out to Big Mike's farmhouse and demanded the right to search his property. Big Mike told her that he needed to take his dog to the vet, but also told her that she was free to search while he was gone. When he returned from the vet, he found the Bruck family was already searching his property, along with 15 other people. They were planning to stay until Chelsea was found, no matter what. Big Mike quickly became the focus of much suspicion. Bruck's family told news outlets that they believed he was responsible for Chelsea's disappearance. They said she was probably tied up in his basement. Their suspicions were confirmed when Big Mike refused to allow police to search his home. He also refused to take a polygraph or provide a DNA sample. However, when the police got a warrant and forced their way in, they found nothing of interest. Families of missing persons have an alarming tendency to get fixated on one person who they know is responsible. Sometimes they're right, but more often they're wrong. Big Mike was not responsible for Bruck's disappearance. Big Mike has said that in the weeks after Chelsea's initial disappearance, random people were constantly coming onto his property to look for Chelsea. Some even tried to break into his house. Perhaps most disturbingly, he'd often wake up in the middle of the night to find drones hovering outside his windows, peeking inside. Eventually, a witness came forward and told police that he saw Chelsea leave the party with a man. The witness reported that Chelsea seemed quite comfortable around this man. It seemed like she knew him, and vice versa. The man apparently made some joke about being allergic to poison ivy in reference to Chelsea's costume. Chelsea and the man hung out together at the party for a bit, then left together in the man's car. The witness was able to help police produce a sketch of the man who'd left with Chelsea. The sketch was then displayed on news channels throughout Michigan as the police solicited the public for help in finding the mystery man. The sketch generated hundreds of tips, but none of them amounted to anything. It seems like this tip must have been inaccurate, because the actual killer ended up looking nothing like the sketch. Suddenly, there was a break in the case. A man named Harlan Bird came forward and told police that he'd seen a group of men harassing Chelsea at the party. Harlan said he'd chased them off, then he'd left Chelsea in a truck while he left to go get help. But when he came back, both Chelsea and the truck were gone. Harlan also said that Chelsea's bloody nose had dripped blood all over his shirt. But when police asked him to give them the shirt for testing, he said he'd already washed it. Something bothered detectives about Harlan's story. He described Chelsea as having blonde hair. Chelsea did have blonde hair, but she dyed her hair purple red to better match with her costume. So why was Chelsea's hair blonde in Harlan's story? Eventually, they were able to get Harlan to admit that he'd made up the whole story. He wanted to look like a hero for helping the police solve a missing person case, even though he had no actual relevant information. At this point, the detectives were quite sure they'd found their killer. To them, it seemed like Harlan had tried to insert himself into the investigation, which is a huge red flag. And while his story had inconsistencies, Harlan had admitted to seeing Chelsea and putting her in a car. They knew they couldn't charge him with murder yet, until they had more evidence on him, but their working theory at this point was that he had killed Chelsea. Then the police got another seemingly valuable tip from a woman named Carrie Carr. Carrie lived in Ohio, but she'd seen information about the Bruck disappearance online, and she was certain that her boyfriend was responsible. He told Carrie that he'd kidnapped Chelsea and killed her. Carrie emphasized that she was sure her boyfriend would try to kill her if he found out she'd told. She implored the police that if they brought him in for questioning, they had to arrest him right then and there. She was emphatic that if they talked to this guy, then they absolutely had to detain him. So they brought the boyfriend in for questioning, and he immediately said that Carrie was trying to frame him. The police never mentioned Carrie to him, he just knew she was responsible. The boyfriend told police that Carrie was lying and she was just trying to get him in trouble. The boyfriend's alibi was corroborated, and then Carrie was arrested for lying to police. She admitted that she'd made it all up. No significant progress was made until April 5th, 2015. The poison ivy costume, which Bruck had worked so hard to create, was found in an abandoned building by a pair of men who were doing something illegal there. The man who found the costume was apparently terrified to call the police about it, because he'd pick up the costume with his hands when he first found it, before he'd realized its significance. He knew his DNA would be on the costume, and so he was afraid they'd think he killed Chelsea. However, he eventually did the right thing and reported it. Ominously, when police received the costume, they discovered it was ripped around the crotch area. However, the detectives' work at the case also discovered an interesting coincidence. It turned out that Harlan Bird, remember, the guy who wanted to be a hero, lived extremely close to where the costume was found, basically right across the street. So they pulled in Harlan again, and this time they were sure he was the guy, because you have to admit, he was starting to look like a pretty viable suspect at this point. He tried to insert himself into the investigation. He lied to police. He admitted to putting Chelsea in a car, and now her costume was found right across from where he lived. Sure, they still weren't going to charge him with murder just yet, but they were definitely heading in that direction. But this time, Harlan was smart, brought a lawyer with him. Harlan admitted he'd lied before, but said he hadn't killed Chelsea. He agreed to take a polygraph, and he passed, eliminating him as a suspect. Chelsea Bruck's leggings were found on September 2nd, 2015. This was a huge break for the case, because the leggings were the first item from which the police were able to get a viable DNA sample. They were able to find DNA from an unknown male. The significance of this can't be overstated, since it finally gave detectives a way to start eliminating suspects. Harlan Bird and Carrie Carr's boyfriend both submitted DNA samples and were cleared, finally eliminating them as suspects once and for all. Big Mike still was reluctant, but eventually he did agree to provide a sample. Big Mike was also cleared. The man who'd found the costume was also tested and cleared. Every other person who'd been considered by police were also cleared, leaving the police with no suspects. Everybody was cleared. They'd reached another dead end. The big break finally came when the detectives were contacted by the Michigan Forensics Laboratory, which informed them they'd found a match for the unknown male DNA found on Bruck's leggings. The DNA was found to be a match for Daniel Clay. Daniel had been arrested for stealing a backpack, and so his DNA had been collected and added to the Michigan DNA database. It must be noted that this case truly would have been 100% unsolvable if not for DNA testing, because Daniel had never even remotely been considered as a suspect up to this point. When the detective spoke with Daniel Clay, he initially denied that he'd ever seen Bruck or spoken to her. However, one of the detectives came up with a sneaky ploy to get him talking. He told Clay that Chelsea Bruck suffered from brittle bone disease, and so if something happened, it was probably an accident. Daniel fell hard for that obvious bait, and he immediately changed his story, that to say that he accidentally killed Chelsea while having totally consensual sex with her. He told police that Chelsea liked it rough, and that she'd begged him to choke her during sex, but he'd accidentally squeezed a bit too hard. Whoopsie, must have been the brittle bone disease. Clay was charged with second-degree murder on July 25th, 2016. However, that was soon increased to first-degree murder. In Michigan, a conviction for first degree results in an automatic life sentence without parole. Second-degree murder is also punishable by life imprisonment, but it isn't automatic. During Clay's trial, the defense had to try and argue that Clay really had unintentionally killed during rough sex. Thankfully, a judge ruled that the defense couldn't probe into Chelsea's sexual history during the trial. I'm normally on the side of the defense should be allowed to do whatever they want, but I'm glad that Chelsea's family was spared that. Clay was found guilty of first-degree murder on May 16, 2017. Chelsea Bruck was buried in the town of Maybe, where she was born. According to Find a Grave, her obituary reads as follows. As a hostess, she was employed by Olga's Kitchen at the Mall of Monroe for 4 years. Her favorite pastimes included watching movies, especially musicals, listening to music, of which Queen was her favorite band, enjoyed playing video games, including Final Fantasy VIII and her favorite television show, Doctor Who. She also enjoyed reading and baking and had a special love for her dog and cats. She was raised very close to her siblings and loved being a part of the Bruck girls. I just wanted to thank Wonderful Variation for writing of Chelsea Bruck. The takeaway for this story from me is to always look out for your friends. You never know if something bad may happen to them. And thank you for coming and relaxing with me. Feel free to subscribe for more content, and good night.